Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just share with you a few slides, if I may. I'm hoping everybody can see me. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Right, okie dokie. So I'm just going to talk about for about 10 minutes or so maximum, and then we'll open it up for a bit more of a Q&A. We can ask any particular questions that come up with this. So before we start, I've got to start the shameless plug, of course, for those of you that don't know a lot about me. I do host my own podcasts, two actually. One is called Influence the Global Podcast. And if you've not had the chance to listen to it, then do tag it. We're on our third season now, and I've interviewed all sorts of influencers, influencer agencies, top brands as well. And we're just trying to really help and educate people navigate through the sort of influencer world. I also host Membership World. So, for those of you that don't know me, I'm the founder of Membership World, which is a community for trade associations, professional bodies, and anybody in the sort of membership space. And then in March this year, I was very fortunate to have published my first book called Influencer Marketing Strategy. I know we've got some authors on the call here. But that was a major achievement, as I'm sure many of you will know. When you publish your first book, it feels like quite an amazing thing to have done. So I'm pleased about that. I'm like some of you. I'm also a speaker, a panelist, and a host as well for many events. Before we get on to the main session, one of my products that I did just want to share with you is I run an influencer marketing program which is over 3 months, and it's a thought leadership program. So it's really about helping individuals really define their online influence with the idea of generating more revenue, creating more customers coming to you and your website or your social media platform and your content consumed by a wider audience. And I go through various steps. I'm not going to go through all of the detail there, but the reason I say that is because, as Naomi said, I like to try and help and support people. And what I've done naturally over the last 20 years, I've just thought to myself, well, why not put that into a program and share some of those insights with people? So if anybody's interested, or you know anybody that like to have a further conversation, then happy to have that sort of offline or book a half an hour strategy call with me. Okay, so we're really talking about sort of podcasts here. That is not my home setup studio, but one of the things that I've certainly learned over the time is it's really important to make sure, if you are wanting to create your own podcast, is that you do have the right kit, because sound quality is super important. And there are lots of there are lots of advice around mic, mixing desks, cameras if you're going to video as well. But you might decide how you're going to run your podcast. Is it going to be just you speaking to the audience and largely about educational or conversational? Or is it going to be you interviewing a guest, which is primarily what I do? And the reason I do that is because effectively it's that credibility by association. Because not only do I want interesting individuals on my show, but also what we want to do is maximize the audience opportunity, because obviously when the show comes out, the guest is going to promote it on their social media and their platforms as well as our own. But you can also do duet interviews. So I'm about to launch another podcast within the promotional products industry, actually, called Let's Talk Merch. And I'm going to do that with another seasoned veteran. So we're going to be interviewing a guest on a duo basis, which is, again, will be quite an interesting format. I've also interviewed people with multiple guests. So that I've done actually one with three guests, and I don't know if any of you have done that before, but that was quite interesting, getting all of that together. But you do get a really great dynamic, and when you're listening to a podcast, what you want to try and do is people like differential with voices as well. Another thing that has been very popular is bite-sized series. So it could be a bunch of shows together in a series of 6 on a particular subject. And the reason why that can work well is because sponsors can quite like that. And arguably what you want to try and do is leverage sponsorship opportunities. That's been in the same way that, look, we all like Netflix, don't we? How many of us are tuning into the series more than we are films? And what's really good is the what's coming next. So it's a really good way of locking in an audience. In terms of promoting your podcast on social media, website or a landing page is obviously certainly something to consider. I actually host it on my own website, which is the Influence one, but it's also hosted on the Branded Content Marketing Association's website. If you've got sponsors involved, you could potentially create a page for them. It's basically multiple opportunities for you to reach out. Try and also get a call to action, because what's the purpose of the podcast? What you're trying to do is get them to find out more about what you offer, the services you offer. Lead them into a Facebook group, lead them into a program, tell them what's coming next, encourage them to link with you on social media platforms. Again, that's a really important thing to do. Just one thing as well, I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear from the others. I tend to do ads, so the sponsor in the middle of the show. Sometimes people do it at the end. If you want to get the highest, actually my format is to do a little bit of an intro to at the beginning and say that this show is sponsored, and then halfway through the interview do the ad, and then at the end just say thank you very much to our sponsor. So they get 3 bites of exposure, and then also making sure that within the show notes you've got a link to them as well. So yeah, on all social media. You can also send it out on a newsletter if any of you have got regular newsletters, or of course emails as well. I tend to do my Influence podcast every fortnight, and I know some of you guys might be doing them more frequently than that. And you can do them as frequently as you want. The only challenge is it's a lot more work because of not only the editing and the time taken and to find the guests and do all of that. One thing you might like to consider is I always try and ask my guests to bring along some case studies of people that they have worked with, or to cite some examples. In fact, I did one recently with a LinkedIn guru, and he mentioned 5 top LinkedIn specialists within the podcast. So when I actually came to post on social media, I tagged the people that were included within the podcast, and they all have really significant audiences as well. So can you see that's a really great way of getting more exposure. Branding is everything, as I'm sure you know. It's about trying to get people listening to your podcast. So if you go to Spotify, the one on the right hand side will be what my main cover is and what it's about, and it gives you a description opportunity afterwards. But what I then do is I brand each cover with the guests and explain a little bit about what's going on there and who they are, minimizing myself. And I know that Dolores, which is on the call, her podcast covers are amazing, and I've seen some from Ryle as well, which is good, and Naomi's got some amazing ones as well. It's horses for courses, really. You might just need to trial and test a few. In fact, what I've done is when I move to another series, so rather than have just one long series, if you break it up into different series, this is also a good time to change a format. So if you wanted to rebrand, or you wanted to change something within the show type, then to do that when you're looking at a new series is quite a good time to do that. I've on the right hand side, you can see here all of the top platforms, and again, it'd be interesting to find out who people are using. But I use Anchor for one, and Podbeam for the other. There are a load of different ones now. They're all sort of competing for exposure, and they offer different services. I mean, arguably, what you really want is to get as much distribution as you possibly can, because that's what it's all about, really. One thing that's really important, I think, is having a proper brief. So what I do is I send my guests everything. If anybody would like to see this brief, then I'll happily send it to you afterwards. You want to just tell me to do that, and I'll happily ping it over to you, so you can see, how long the recording will take. How is the podcast recorded? And this is just a little snapshot. Actually, it's about 7 or 8 pages long, but it really gives an understanding to the guests, so they're primed and ready and what to expect. Now, some of you might want to be a guest on other people's shows, and I've been fortunate to be on about 25 different shows over the last 6 months or so. There's a great community called Matchmaker.fm. Sorry, I've spelt that wrong. It's Matchmaker.fm. Yeah. Go check that out. There are literally loads and loads and loads of guests, podcasts on there, so you can either promote your podcast there if you're looking for a guest, or you can find a show that you'd like to be a guest on and reach out to them, and it's totally free. There's a couple of Facebook communities as well that you might like to consider, which have been really helpful. One's called Podcast Guest Collaboration Community, and the other one is called Podcast Nation. There's some really good things in there, and a lot of advice, which is really helpful. I know we've got some podcast producers on there. I just wanted to let you know that I have a partnership with Neil, who's a radio DJ as well as a podcast producer. And what we do, we actually do quite a lot with trying to promote it into the association and membership communities. But if anybody wants some support with setting up a podcast, then we're more than happy to do so. What Neil also does is he trains the speakers as well, because you can have somebody that's got great content, but quite frankly, is not very exciting to listen to. So it's all about how we promote that through the show. Anyway, those are a few little thoughts from me, and I'm really quite interested to hear a little bit more from you. So, anybody like to sort of kick off? Let's start with the podcasters at the moment. So, Dolores, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your experiences, good, bad, indifferent, about what you've found from content creation?
Wow, where to start? I mean, I've seen in the group today, some of you already are podcast hosts, and it will be interesting to know to what extent you are involved in your own podcast, rather than just technically hosting the interviews, or whether you are involved in the scripting, in the production, in the post-production, in the promotion. And it's an interesting point, because that really sums the efforts that we all put into podcasting, I think. Gordon, you were sharing about your partners in production, in podcast production, so that's great. But then I think I'd be curious to know, for example, you guys can just put it in the chat whether you produce your own podcast, or whether you are the marketing force behind your own podcast, or how you go about it. Do you outsource it, or you do it yourself? So personally, my story, as a person working in hospitality and travel, as you will know, one of the worst hit industries as a result of the last 12 months, I envisioned, I was reflecting on what can I do to share the industry voices that could help the industry recover from a travel perspective. And of course, you can consider blogging, you can consider videoing, and just show up, on your channels. But I was playing with the idea of having this podcast, and I didn't really know what I was putting myself into at that time. But I'm glad I did, because 6 months down the line, the podcast is now, it's called Truth Behind Travel. And it started as a platform where industry players, industry operators would have an opportunity to talk about what are they doing to support the industry to restart, whether they're working in a hotel or they're working in a tourist board, for example, or an airline. And I imagine this podcast to be useful, not just to the trade, but also to the consumers. So when they want to know a little bit more than just wanderlust, like, how cool is to go to Nicaragua, for example, you might want to know what's going on there before booking your next ticket, for example. And that's what the podcast does. What I underestimate, Gordon, to be honest with you, is the amount of work that goes behind the scene. And I wish I knew better. I wish I knew how much it takes to research, to prepare, and to offer a quality content. Like, I can see it. There are episodes that I research more than others, and as anybody does, of course, as I'll be very honest with you. And I see the listening ratings, for example, if people drop after 15 minutes or drop after 20 minutes, and I see which episode has been listened to fully, and then I look at this data and I plan ahead. But you need a body of data before you can start planning around this, and that only can be collected over time, I believe.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point, actually, Dolores. Just on that latter point about the average listening time to the shows. I just want to put that out to everybody. What are we finding is the average listening time to a podcast, either as a listener or as a producer?
On my podcast.
Sorry. No, I was just thinking, it's a really, really interesting point, and I was just thinking, audience retention, is absolutely key, but it translates in different ways. It's always what you want, rather than numbers. Really, this is another important. But now we've migrated to TV. It's all about audience retention rather than the numbers. If you're looking to build the foundational stuff. So it's and the other thing, as was mentioned there, the format is absolutely key, and your demographic audience that you're actually speaking to is absolutely key. Most people, they don't, they learn this along the way, and that's fine. I've always learned the same way, by doing, not thinking I can do, knowing I can do it and doing it, and then, adjusting as we go. But these things are fundamentals, they really are. And podcasting, you find your own way, it's like your own branding. Of course, your rounded branding approach, as Gordon, is absolutely pivotal all the time. And another mistake that people make, because we're branding, we create national and global brands. This is what we basically do. We do everything from the financial modeling, to take them out to the deep ocean. So we know what to do, certainly, but we know certainly what not to do as well, right? Which is just as important. But it's, people think, as well, they have the brand, they have the concept, they have the idea. Oh, and that's great, we're finished. But absolutely no, that's just the beginning, because you have to keep pivoting. You have to keep developing, it's just such a vast area. But, hooking onto what's current and trending is always a good idea, and having a unique format that is unique to you, but that you're strong in, is another good idea,
there's a lot to be said, isn't there, for niching down sometimes,
Absolutely.
And we all get hell bent on, oh dear, I've not got enough listeners, or when I first started out on myself, I was only getting a few hundred downloads. I mean, literally 200 or so, and I was thinking, oh my god, this is going to take a lot to move this needle. But as somebody said to me, Gordon, remember, this is all about influencer marketing. So you are getting the people that are listening are going to be interested around influencer marketing. So actually, the quality of the audience is going to be quite tight, as it is with Dolores's one in that sort of travel space. Who's somebody said? Abigail, lovely to see you here as well. I noticed in the chat you said sort of. Did you say 35 to 40 minutes? Was the average time? Did I see that?
So hello everyone, sorry I couldn't introduce myself earlier. For me, like, I love podcasts, but I love it, like everything I consume, I love it for different reasons. So I like a 15-minute one to sort of change my mindset, get me in a good state, uplifting, but I love a really much longer interview. So I'm obsessed with neuroscience because I want to understand how we can rewire our brains to change our lives. So I'll listen to the neuroscience ones where they're talking about all of the habits and the things that we need to be hacking in order to be able to live a better life as a human. And those ones go on. So they can go on for like 45, some of them even go on for like an hour. So, and Josh Rogan, I guess, would fall into this arena. So here's my top hack, and I don't know if this is something that any of you consider. Pretty much every podcast I listen at speed, because I think most people talk really slow. So most podcasts I listen to at 1.25 speed. Some podcasts I listen to at 1.75 or even 2. And I've even started to do this with my YouTube videos now. And I spoke to another girl the other day. I was interviewed by her on one of her podcasts. She says she listens to 3 things at the same time. And I'm like, I think that's too much for me. Like, everybody's brain is different. It's too much information coming at me. But anyway, I'm just fascinated by how we're consuming content. And I don't think it's something that producers generally are talking about or considering when because it's edutainment that we're producing, right? And so I'm watching the YouTubers, and they're doing all these like gizmos and making all these noises and everything and cutting away, which is great. But sometimes I'm like, get to the point. So then I'm speeding through their stuff, and they don't even realize that all of these edits that they're doing are irrelevant. But maybe I'm not their target audience. Anyway, so I'm just super excited to learn and to hear and what works for other people. And I've probably been on about 8 podcasts in the last year. And I'd love to get your how-to sheet, because some podcasts I've been on have literally been slick machines, and other podcasts I've been on have been, well, this is being recorded, so I'll be kind. They've been sellotaped together, and you can tell, like, from some of them, the experience the people have had and how good they are at producing and what kind of content that they're trying to do. And some of those haven't been good at marketing them. So it's a really, really interesting sector. And I'm going to shut up now, but I'll just finish on, and I haven't started my own podcast. During lockdown last year, I did 100 episodes live streamed to LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And I was going to turn them into a podcast, but then I got into my head about, this is really not good quality. People might not like it, but people loved it at the time. So then I've just done nothing with it. So I've kind of stopped and started. I've started things on Buzzsprout and then haven't pushed the button, because maybe, like Stephen was saying, I just really want to understand, like, who my person is, why they would keep tuning in. And I don't want to, like, get going, because I'm probably ADHD, actually, to be fair, get going and then just get bored and be like, I don't want to keep talking about this, it's really dull. So I'm using Clubhouse at the minute and running a room every week in Clubhouse and sort of using that as my thing. So that's me.
Thank you, Abigail. Yeah, I've come off Clubhouse, actually. I don't know what's...
yeah, I don't like it, Gordon. It's not, you know, all these different platforms. I haven't the time. Like, to do, I really haven't the time anyway.
It's a time killer, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's a time killer.
I don't need it.
Raoul, love to hear from you about what because you've done a lot. Do you do every week or every...
2 a week. 2 a week.
2 a week, guys.
Yeah, it's quite a lot. I get it.
So yeah, Lindsey. So my partner in the podcast, Lindsey Adams, was global head poobah of everything. He was head of the Global Speakers Federation. He's actually been awarded. The UK equivalent is probably one of the things you get tapped on the head by the Queen or something, the Queen's birthday honors or something for services to the global speaking community. He's got the Australian equivalent called an Order of Australia Medal. Excellent. And so his connections worldwide are amazing. Like literally sent out a note, and we got, hundreds of people knocking on the door. We cut that down. So we record on a Tuesday, we record 2 to 3 episodes every week or every second week. And then we drop episodes Mondays and Thursdays. We try and do it without editing, unless people burst out laughing in silly laughter, and we try and cut that out. My PA was doing the edits, and then she went on maternity leave, and has just resigned. So I've employed a new PA who has an honors degree in marketing, who starts with me on the 23rd of August. So I went through the process of documenting my editing process. So from the audio file, how we send that through. So I don't know if anyone's come across Niels Brabant. He runs Niels based out of London. It's a leadership podcast that he runs out of London. But Niels taught me about, using Auphonic, which is an AI engine to normalize and compress all your audio files. So you literally drop it in and does that for you. So I've actually screenshot my process so that my new PA, who starts in 2 weeks' time, will literally pick up that document and carry on the editing for us. So yeah, we started November last year with 20 episodes. So we started with 20, although I'm told you need at least 4 or 5, but not 20. We just went a bit overboard. And then we've dropped 2 episodes a week since then, and our 100th episode comes out next week.
Wow, that is super impressive. One thing that somebody did say to me in America is that the reason they do the podcasts is because it allows them to get to their target audience. So what they do is they interview their target audience, and therefore, because you're effectively giving them opportunity to promote themselves. And I must admit, since doing some of the podcasts on Membership World, I've now been talking to people about other products as a result of doing that, because you're suddenly in conversation. So it's quite an interesting strategy as well. Thank you, Raoul. Naomi, you're a well-honed expert in this field. I'm honoured to have you on the call. So do you want to share some of your thoughts around what your experiences have been?
I very much relate to what Dolores was saying about being quite naive in the early stages about how long it all takes. I personally don't outsource anything, as I said in the chat. And I actually really enjoy the editing process. I edit my interviews. I like my guests to feel relaxed enough to know that if they say something wrong or they don't like, we are having conversations that go quite deep into things. The interview I put out a couple of days ago was with a woman who talked about being a victim of domestic abuse, for example. And I think for me, quite often, my episodes are usually between 40 and 55 minutes, but I might record for up to an hour and a half, because I think a lot of the gold comes with giving people time to talk. And I think if you're doing something where you're asking people to talk quite personally, then I think for me as an interviewer, giving people the gift of time to express themselves is what really gives me a good interview, I think. But that does then require some fairly heavy cutting, and in order for it not to be an interview that I would consider to be excessively long. And when I'm teaching people about podcasting, I think your podcast can be as long or as short as you want it to be. My husband listens to podcasts that are 2.5 hours long. I personally wouldn't, but he loves them, and wow. I think he's very invested in that podcast. He's a very dedicated audience member, as it were. But I kind of feel that for me, I think I would agree with Abigail that, 45 minutes roughly for an interview is probably about right. That's only my personal opinion. And yeah, I think there are some brilliant editors out there, but I just prefer to do it myself. And then, yeah, one of my really big pet hates, which I think Auphonic as a platform corrects, and I think Raoul's right to mention that is noise levels within an interview. So many, even professionally produced podcasts, will have different voices and different music at different volume levels, which is really off-putting for the listener, I think, and it's just a sign of, it can make it sound quite amateur, and literally all you need to do is plug it through Auphonic as post-production, and that will correct all of that for you. I think it's one of the most underrated and very, very cheap tools. It costs literally a few dollars, and you just pop your MP3s or WAV files through that, and it sorts all of that out for you, and I just think polishes everything really, really well. So it's always something that I recommend people to use, even if they're putting their files through Adobe Audition or another kind of more professional software. I think Audition is a great addition to your suite as well. So I would definitely recommend that. But yeah, otherwise, I just sort of feel that these days, having a podcast, whether you've got one or not, having it as part of your marketing toolbox in a business is really helpful. It's a great way of creating content that you can repurpose elsewhere. I think, Gordon, you talked about the connections that come from being amongst influencers, thought leaders, building a brand by association through them. I think it's really useful. Really? I started podcasting really as a hobby and because I was interested in what I was doing, but the landscape has really, really changed in the last 3 to 4 years, I think, and that now people recognise that the sort of professionalism that comes with it is really just a vital part to many, many businesses these days.
Yeah. I mean, what I find, that's lovely, thank you, Naomi. I mean, if you think about it, to have, I know, Abigail, you were talking about, listening to three or four things all at the same time. I've listened to podcasts when I've gone round the lakes on my walks, and that podcaster has 100% of my attention. The power of something in your ear is quite overwhelming, as opposed to when you are looking at working and you've got a podcast in the background. It's slightly different, and I'm just wondering whether or not we as presenters help position our listeners as to when it is a good time for them to listen. I mean, I actually don't do that on my podcast, but now I've been thinking about it, because in a way you want total focus. And Fiona, what's your thoughts on what you've heard?
I think what you're saying just there, and what Naomi was saying is really interesting, particularly around the idea of focus and when people listen and how much attention you can assume that your listeners are giving you. Obviously, I'm not at the point where I'm making my own podcast, but I think just as being a consumer of podcasts, I would say that shorter is better. And I really like that idea of actually saying to people, right now it's time to switch up everything else, or if you're going for a walk, now it's time to kind of just tune in to me. And I feel that if you go for a shorter amount of time, you've got more right to ask people to give you your whole attention. And the other thing I was going to say actually is, and I really liked Abigail's comment about the sellotaping together. So there's lots of podcasts I've listened to that people don't have loads of equipment. They have made something. There's some really interesting content there, but because they're not editing, they've recorded the podcast and then they've just put it all out with all the ums and ahs and the bits that aren't that interesting. And then it's padded with a lot of stuff that isn't that interesting, and the interesting points get lost. So I suppose somewhere in there's a question that I'm kind of building up to the people who are doing it about how important it is to do that edit and how much time to dedicate towards doing your edit compared to your construction of your podcast and the questions you're going to ask, because I think it's a real shame when those 2 or 3 or sort of that sort of 15-20 minutes of really key information on a podcast is just lost to me, because I might be beginning to tune out because there's a lot of filler stuff. So that's one question. And the other thing that I think is really important as well to consider is how you are as an interviewer. So my background is journalism, so I've interviewed people for 20 odd years or so, but for print, and sometimes in the past when I've listened back to myself, it's been excruciating, and I just thought they were just about to say something absolutely key, and in you went with your own comments. And I hear that a lot on podcasts, and I just think, that's
a really interesting point, Fiona. Sorry to jump in now, but one of the things that I had with Neil is when I started out in the early days, he was training me to be a better interviewer and to be a presenter, and to use that sort of tone and pitch and emphasis, because effectively being a podcaster is closer to radio, isn't it? So what he would do, I would create an intro script and an outro script, and what he would do would highlight some words within it. So I would say something as part of my preamble, and then he would say something, and I'd say, blimey, that's really good. And so before long, we just switched it around. So I think having somebody that isn't, I mean, obviously you've got to be yourself and you've got to be authentic, but there is a knack to being interesting, isn't it? And I think we can all learn from that. And you're right. In some of the interviews, Neil would ring me up straight away and said, you interrupted him at a time when he was just about to say something really important. So I have had to push back as well. So it's a really good point that you've made there.
Can I just give a tip there, Gordon?
Please.
Which is, so a piece of advice I was given, which comes indirectly from Lewis Hamilton in Formula One with regard to listening and interrupting. I used to be a terrible interrupter, and have really, really worked on that because it was an awful habit of mine. But somebody said to me that Lewis Hamilton, when he's driving at breakneck speeds, repeats to himself to brake late. And what that means is that when you're going into a corner, in order to get the best performance, you want to wait as long as you can before you apply the brakes. And that translated into podcasting means to wait as long as you possibly can before you say anything to the other person. And so if I'm tempted to jump in, I now just say to myself in my head, just brake late, and actually just thinking that little thought has really helped me to think, just wait, because you don't know what's coming. And there might be just some absolute nugget about to appear out of your guest's mouth that you're going to lose otherwise.
I love that. And in fact, my sister actually, who runs a listening program, she specializes in that. She talks about an interruption being an assault on the brain. And I love that word as well, because in a way, if somebody's interrupting you in full flow, that it's almost like it's a punch to the side to your thinking process, and then they can forget what they wanted to say then. So anyway, Raoul, you want to chip in?
I was going to say, I mean, it's interesting having a co-host, because and I think when I interviewed you, Gordon, Lindsey wasn't available, and that was interesting. But I'd say of the 120 episodes we've recorded, we've done over 100 together.
Have you? Right.
Thing is, because we're recording most of them on Zoom, we're pointing at each other. We're using gesticulating. So what's interesting about it is we've got this sign language between us, where we'll ask questions alternating. But the interesting part about that is if, like you've said something and I want to continue the discussion from the question I've asked you, I'll be indicating that to Lindsey. Now you as the guest are seeing us indicating. So you're seeing we want to ask you another question. So most guests will then stop at that point and allow you to ask the next question, even though it's Lindsey and I communicating with each other saying, I'm asking the next question or you ask the next question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
But it took us 20 episodes to get there.
If I could come in there, guys, just to give a bit of view of what I've. That's a really interesting point, you know. And I was the same. What we've done is we call it sacred listening, right? You know, even on meetings, right? It's very important to wind that one back, right? And you know, you're in so much more of a position of influence, if you want to call that, or position of, you know, with that long pause, and even to get your messaging in when you come succinctly, or even to get the messaging in that you need to hear from others. It's a massive point, you know. But what we've done, sacred listening, we call it. So we start with the sacred listening first, rather than the other way around, because it's like the brain. Some of our brains, obviously, it's like the process is just so fast, it's just spinning out, you know, answers, or you know. So this helped me, you know, because I was interrupted. I was terrible.
Did you say something, Stephen? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Big boy, keen to get your thoughts on anything. Do you listen to podcasts or yourself?
Yeah, no, I do listen. Sorry, my voice again. I do listen to podcasts. I want to revert back to the question where you were talking about the integrations of brands, brand deals, and understand what you think about the optimal integration is. Is it 10 seconds into the actual podcast? Is it halfway through, or is it at the end? Because I know doing the integrations that I do for some of the branded content, what I tend to find that works is initial 10-second intro, and then again probably about a minute and a half into the actual segment of the podcast where they're actually thanking the sponsors for the donations as well. So I just wanted to get your opinion on that. But in terms of podcasting as well, going back to Abigail, I do agree with you in terms of speeding up the actual recording up to 1.75, because I just me personally feel like I'm ingesting a hell of a lot more, a lot quicker, and I don't have to spend that hour's content in the full hour. So yeah, sorry.
That's all right. That's all right, Ivan. That's fine. No. Thank you for that. Bless him. Yeah, what does anybody think about what Abraham was saying then?
I think that's a really interesting point that Abraham said. And so what I'm going to share is just my view as a listener, because I don't know what the right thing is. But when I'm listening to podcasts and they jam in some really random, there's this one guy, it's sponsored by like a meat box. And I'm not being funny, like I'm listening to it and he's talking about one thing that might be really esoteric, and then he's like, thank you to the butcher box for your yada yada, and I'm like, okay then. And so I think that there's a real classy way of doing it. And I prefer some of the podcasts where they'll do it at the start and they'll say, you know, we want to thank our sponsors, and then at the end, but say something like, it's more relevant for me when what they're recommending has helped them in their business, their career, or their life. So they're saying like, you know, I use this, it saved me time, it helped me find, it did yada yada. So I think as a podcaster, you've just really got to be very conscious that yes, cash funds dreams, but you could be ramming in Buy My Chicken Fillets, which don't really relate to your sustainability podcast or the guests that you've had on. And so I think it's about thinking what you want out of the next 2 to 5 years of it, and not just trying to get the money. And then I've got other people who I listen to who are like, look, my podcast's for me to connect to you, my audience. My podcast isn't for me to make money out of selling other people's stuff. So I'm not going to put adverts on it. So I think that's also an interesting way. And I love what you said, Gordon, about doing series, and so saying this series is sponsored, because I think then that does make sense. So as a marketer, which is actually my background randomly, it's really about understanding how this fits in with your avatar and your customer journey and making sense, because your audience aren't dumb, and it is going to make them go a bit like, oh, that's a bit weird. Like, do you need the money, or did you not think about this? Or
I mean, it's a really good point, actually. And I mean, when I launched Membership World, I managed to get a sponsor, which was just to give you guys some an idea of what I charged, it was £2,500 for 6 episodes, and I got that from 0 listeners. But what they did was they realised where I was going with this, and it was unique. We did like a very short little advert, and it was recorded not by me but by a professional voiceover person. But the way I bring this into the interview, and it is halfway through, I say, John, that's really, really fascinating. We're going to hear more from John and Rachel after this. So in a way, it just is a way of almost building up to the advert and then dropping back again. So that it's very, very short, but also the company is totally focused to the membership sector. It's an event platform, so that they, even in the ad, they make reference to that as well. So, and I do then thank them on the outro, and I do just say something at the beginning. And that's my format. But I mean, there are other people, Abigail, as you've rightly said, just don't decide to take any advertising at all, and they realise that it's a different way of just generating awareness and a revenue stream. Anybody else want to chip in?
Yeah, I think if I can come in and add some value, because it's interesting, right? But when you really get down to it, this is where you really get professional, Gordon, as you would know, and how to transition with an audience. But it's connectivity, is the first thing, right?
Absolutely.
And your clarity of messaging is the first thing as well. So it's an experiential journey that we're taking our listeners on, whatever medium it is, right? But especially on a podcast, if it's audio, and there are different formats. I mean, what I do, and I know some people, massive channels, they're massive channels, so their feedback is relevant. And some say, look, when they get so big, they don't even want an intro, because people, they don't, when they've taken it away, they haven't said, oh, we missed the intro, could you bring it back? Right? How I do it is different. We'll come in, it has to be really structured, the format. So I'll come in for 20 seconds, piece to camera with the right hook, coming next. Then we'll come in with a bit of an intro like that. And then I'll come back in again. And then I'll say, thanks, guys. It is about respecting your audience. Thank you, guys, blah, blah, blah. And I'll say a little bit. They already know what's coming, so the brain is programmed, so they're waiting for the content. But you've got your bit of marketing in there. It's fair game, figure 8 and all that stuff. They get that. And then I'll go straight into the raw content. But we're going to go straight into the raw content, and I'll have it in 3 parts. But it's very, very, there are many, many tricks here in the format, but I think the best one is how we've grown meteorically is by the quality of guests, obviously, and the collaboration of their numbers, and it depends what algorithm that you're working with, because they work different, and how you use the keywords. But that really is the difference, because I've seen really highly polished content producers who get no views, and then people are just on there raw hitting it, and they're up in the thousands. So the front end of it is 35%, your front end of it is the glossy stuff, maybe 40, but a good 60% is your back end stuff, is your is your structures, your formats, your strategic collaborations, and how you use that, and your keyword strategy. This is the most important thing of all. No. Do you agree, Gordon?
I do. It is about getting and understanding your audience. And what I like about what you've said is you're almost training them about what's going to happen next, and what they need to do. It's managing their expectations and being consistent. I mean, that's what influencer marketing is all about, is doing stuff time and time again. Guys, it's been a blast. I have to say, I could talk about this, as I'm sure all of you could.
Yeah, we could.
We
have a crazy day ahead.
Do connect with each other for sure. And we're going to be again here next week at 9 o'clock as per normal. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks to everyone. Thank you. You can connect anytime with me. Thank you.
Such an interesting conversation. Thank you. Take care.
We'll speak again. Bye.
Bye-bye.